Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Patrick Jimerson. I'm the Assistant to the Vice President of Student Affairs and the Director of Minority Student Programs. It is my pleasure to be asked by the Black Student Organization to introduce our distinguished speaker for the evening. Professor Clark was born in Union Springs, Alabama, grew up in Columbus, Georgia, migrated to New York City with an ambition to become a writer. After serving 4 years in the U.S. Air Force, where he was a sergeant major, he attended New York University and majored in history and world literature. Early in his beginnings, Mr. Clark studied the world history of African people long before it was fashionable. As a fiction writer, he has published over 50 short stories in magazines in this country and abroad. His best-known short story is The Boy Who Painted Christ Black, has been translated into more than a dozen languages. His articles and conference papers on African and Afro-American history and culture are published in leading journals and throughout the world. Among the positions he has held is a feature writer for the Pittsburgh Courier, 57 through 58, research director of the first African Heritage Exposition, August of 59, and the associate editor of the Freedom Ways magazine, 1962 through the present. He is currently a professor in the Department of Black and Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College, New York City, and distinguished visiting professor of African history at the African Studies and Research Center at Cornell University. This page goes on for quite a distance more, but Professor Clark, being the modest man that he is, has asked that I refrain from enthralling his virtues for quite a while longer. And with that, I'd like to give you Professor John Henry Clark.
Thank you very much. One of the reasons I'm glad to be here, along with some better ones, is that I can get partly warm for a change. This is spring weather in comparison to New York City. What I'm going to be talking about is something that a whole lot of people have just now begun to recognize exists, and that is the role of African people in the history of the world, and the role of African people when they were not slaves, but when they were controlling their own nations, and they were controlling to a great extent the destiny of man. I think the recent TV series on the book Roots has made the teaching of African history both easy and difficult. It has made it easy because more people are willing to listen. It has made it more difficult because people in general are not ready to conceive that there was an African history before slavery, and there's an African history, a history of achievement that has nothing at all to do with slavery. There's a need to locate African people on the map of human geography. To do this, we must look at Africa in an entirely different way, using a different frame of reference. Words, mostly the wrong ones, frustrate our attempt to locate African people and to look at their cultures honestly. Words like Black Africa, Negro Africa, Hamitic Africa, Arab Africa, and the general descriptions of African people, and most of these descriptions are in error. The word Black Africa is not correct because it presupposes that there is a legitimate white Africa, and there is no legitimate white Africa. Everybody in Africa who cannot be classified as African is either an invader or a descendant of an invader. And so when we speak of Africa, You don't have to qualify it with the word black. Most African people are black, are a variety of brown. There are a few African people, not mixed with whites or Arabs, who tend to be light in complexion. And these people, to the best of our knowledge, are as indigenous to Africa as some of the darkest of Africans. The word Negro Africa has no legitimate meaning because there's no such thing as a Negro. Some lazy Spaniard or Portuguese took an adjective and made a noun out of it and slapped it on a people, and unfortunately, they accepted it along with a whole lot of other people. The people from Africa, outside of Africa, are African wheresoever they happen to be. And it is rather strange that no one has any difficulty in saying German American or Italian American or other kinds of American. It rolls off of the tongue, and the tongue continues to be functional when you identify people by their basic ethnic background. For people to be whole spiritually, they have to relate to land, history, and culture. And the word Negro relate to a condition and has no valid meaning in the reference to a people. And the phrase Hamitic Africa is an error because the word Hamitic refers more to a language than a people, and the word came in wide use when there was an attempt to prove that Egypt belonged to somebody other than African people, and that the cultures of Egypt was brought in from the outside, Asia, probably some parts of Europe, and there is no evidence at all to prove this. And this assumption has been going around for many years. The word Arab Africa, of course, is also correct because Africa existed before the Arabs existed as a people. And when the Arabs came into Africa in the 7th and the 8th century in large numbers after the rise of Islam, the Arab in North Africa is today a minority. And a whole lot of people don't seem to understand that. Most of the people who are of light complected in North Africa are Berbers, and most of the mixtures came from the Sudan. Nasser, who was head of the Arab League, was not an Arab, and he boasted about the fact that he was head of the Arab League and not an Arab. He also boasted about the fact that he was one shade darker than Ralph Bunche, and if blacks called Ralph Bunche their brother, he wanted to know what they're going to call him. I think we need to reshuffle and redefine terminology as it relates to African people in order to locate African people on the map of human geography. And the Africans need to be very bold about this. People decide what they are named, and people decide what name they want to answer to. There was once a people in Asia called Siamese, and they wrote books about the quaint Siamese. They decided that they were Thai-speaking people, and their country would be called Thailand. And they sent letters to the post offices of the world on and after a certain date. This country will be referred to as Thailand. If you address a letter here with the word Siam on it, we will throw it into the sea. And if you come here and address a single citizen as a Siamese, we will put you in jail for defaming his character. No problem. Everybody accepted them as people of Thailand and Thai-speaking people. No problem at all. They made the decision as to what they should be named. In a work on the subject called The Word Negro, Its Origin and Evil Use, Richard Moore, the author, said, "Slaves and dogs are named by their masters. Free men name themselves." And I think when we look at African people in the world, we must begin by recognizing an entire new terminology in relationship to African people, and we must begin to respect their right to be referred to however they wish to. Now, the difficulty in placing Egypt in proper perspectives in African history is to look at the Egyptian people who now live in Egypt. Now you go to this descendant of the motley crew who originally destroyed the greatness of Egypt, and you go to him and you ask him about ancient Egypt, and he braces up as though he relates to ancient Egypt. He has no relationship to ancient Egypt. He's the descendant of an invader, and he drove a lot of the original population of Egypt to the south. There are excellent works on this by African scholars and white scholars too. And a lot of this work is not particularly new. A lot of it is over 100 years old. So Egypt was properly defined years ago, and its southern African origin was traced and documented years ago. And yet we continue to look on North Africa and to look on Egypt as though this is a white nation. And a whole lot of Egyptians are rather delighted by the whole thing, because this gives them an association with the ancient world that they did not have. Now, in order to understand Africa within the context of world history, we must be bold enough to place African history at the center of world history. We must also be well informed in African history, in particular, in world history in general. And when we take this stand, we must be able to defend ourselves academically, step by step. And if I could not defend this point academically, I would not be taking it. What I'm trying to say is that that continent and its people, considered to be the last entry in history, was obviously the first entry in history. Now, every time they dig for old stones and old bones and find the oldest object that man has ever identified, that object is nearly always found someplace in Africa. Dr. Leakey's first diggings and the finding of the remains of an African people that he called Zanjanthropus, 1,750,000 years old. Homo habilis, his second find, about 2 million years old. About 6 months after the death of Leakey, his son Robert and his wife Mary and the African assistant, unfortunately forgotten in all of this, Maccabe, made a find of bones and stones in Kenya. And this cluster of ancient African bones turned out to be 2,600,000 years old. In December of 1973, while I was visiting Ethiopia, and I like to think that they arranged it for me, untrue though it is, they found the remains of a cluster of human beings in the hills of Ethiopia. The carbon dating on these old bones proves that this group of people were from 3,500,000 years old to 4 million years old. They have not found the remains of human beings any place in the world comparable in age to the remains that they have found in Africa. Now, then what is the difficulty? The difficulty is that there are those of liberal persuasion in the academic community who can well acknowledge that mankind started in Africa, and yet when they say civilization and organized societies, they look elsewhere. But if they put the two things together and they go together logically, you will not only see the basis of African history, but the basis of human history. And one of the main reasons why we do not know this, and it has not been taught in our schools, is that once you acknowledge the history and the humanity of a people, you cannot acknowledge that and also acknowledge that you have a right to enslave them. Because once the humanity of a people is acknowledged, you have to acknowledge their right to nationness, their right to a personality, and their right to proceed as free men in the world, and the ability to do everything all other human beings do, including making of a nation or the destroying of a nation. And in looking at the role of the African in world history, we must look at the beginning of human history. This African who moved from some place in Southeast Africa and who began first to populate Africa and subsequently to populate other parts of the world. Now understand me clearly. I did not say that mankind started only in Africa. I said the evidence of the first man can be found in Africa. And it seems rather logically that man developed in a lot of other places, but not concurrent with the development of man in Africa, because we have no proof that he developed concurrently. He developed later. And yet the curiosity and the migration of people brought a whole lot of people together to create different physical amalgams and different species. Now, we were late in hearing about the existence of a people called Europeans. In fact, the word Europe was not used in ancient times. The Romans and the Greeks didn't use the word Europe. In fact, the word Europe, as meaning all of that part of Northern Asia that was called Europe, came into widespread use during the period of the Crusades. This was not the first use of the word, but the first extensive use of the word as applying to all of that geography dates from this period. Now, once more, we must look at Egypt, because the steal of Egypt is one of the greatest academic crimes in Western historiography. And an academic crime where they left nothing to chance, and it was deliberate. And yet all of the stealing of this country has not held up, because many of the stealers changed their mind. Egyptology, a comparatively recent discipline, really did not get underway until Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. And Napoleon, who had ambition to establish himself at this front door of Africa and move into the rest of Africa, just assumed that they were white, but to make sure that he was on sound grounds, he sent people with the order to prove it. And most the scholars that he had sent were bought and paid for, and naturally would come back and tell him what he wanted to listen to. It was during this period, during this time, that the nose of the Sphinx was broken, not accidentally, but by artillery fire from a part of Napoleon's army. And when one of Napoleon's searchers for white people saw that nose and those lips, he said, "My God, these people are," and you know what the last word is. And it wasn't complimentary. Unfortunately for Napoleon, he sent one man on the expedition who did not need Napoleon's favor, from a rich family, and who went on the mission more because he wanted to go than because Napoleon wanted him to go. His name was Count Vornese. Count Vornese wrote an excellent work on it, Ruins of Empires, and he went beyond Egypt to Ethiopia and to what is now the Sudan, and documented the fact that this was a distinct African people, and that they laid the basis for so much that we think is human culture and civilization. Napoleon and his finders would reject Vornese's opinion, but all of the opinion of Napoleon's hand-picked archaeologists, all of these opinions have perished, even in the library. And Count Vornese's excellent work, Ruins of Empires, remain one of the great works on African historiography that attempted honestly to put the record straight. I think what has confused this subject is certain assumptions, and these assumptions meant to ingratiate the ego of Western man, mostly after the 15th century. There was no widespread distortion of African history before the 15th century. A lot of misinformation, but no attempt to read the African systematically out of the history of the world. And when the Portuguese went down the coast of Africa in the early part of the 15th century, they did not go looking for slaves. They had been acquainted with Africans. African influence had dominated the Mediterranean for almost 1,000 years, and it had dominated Spain and Portugal for at least 800 years. And the Africans were losing out in the Mediterranean at the time Europe began to pull itself together after the Crusades and began to go out into the broader world, using a lot of technical information on maritime skill that they had learned from books that had been translated in Spain. For in Spain, that combination called Moors, Arabs, Berbers, and other mixtures of Africa, had set up schools of translation, and they had translated the technical knowledge coming out of China, then the most advanced maritime and technical nation in the whole world. They had translated this knowledge. They had introduced the concept of longitude, latitude, and then some maps fell into the hands of Prince Henry of Portugal, who opened a school to teach navigators. Now, and when the Portuguese arrived in East Africa, the African pilots had to show them how to get to China, And why did the African pilots know how to get to China? Principally because they had been to China. And there was great trade between China and other parts of Asia in Africa, and that had gone on for 1,000 years. And this was really the second 1,000 years of trade between Africa and between Asia. The first 1,000 years started around 1500 BC, when the great woman, Queen Hatshepsut, initiated relationships between Asia and Africa. This would last 1,000 years and fade away, and trade would begin again about the 5th century AD and began to taper off around the 16th century AD, when for some reasons in Chinese history, which I still cannot explain, at a time when they were appreciably ahead of Europe in maritime skill and technology, they withdrew from the sea and went into a period of isolation, and a lot of people took their discoveries and moved ahead of them. And the same people who took their discoveries and moved ahead of them would later literally occupy China and put signs in a city called Shanghai saying Chinese and dogs not allowed. This was the period of the literal foreign occupation of large cities in China, and these foreign occupiers had their own court, judge, and jury, police force within the body of an otherwise sovereign nation. Now, what in their personality, in their culture, that made them either forget or put aside their own achievement and let the world seize it and pull ahead of them technically, is something which I one day might be able to explain, which I am unable to explain at this time. And one of the great ironies of history, inasmuch as the African had iron and had it appreciably ahead of other nations, and the Chinese had gunpowder, had they had enough larceny in their hearts, they could have come together and taken over the world and still would have had the world. Now, I don't appreciate anybody taking over the world, and I do not think that any people have advanced to the point where they have the right to dictate the destiny of another people. I think the next world, if it is to exist at all, is going to have to recognize the sovereignty of every nation in the world, be it large and small, and every man is going to have to guard his own turf and stay on his own turf. Now, these assumptions about Africa, propagated by the Europeans, forgot a lot that is well documented in African history, whether you take it from an African point of view or a European point of view. And I'm referring to the information on the number of Greek philosophers who studied in the mystery schools of Egypt and had no body of thought that could be identified as philosopher until they studied in these schools. What were these Greek scholars studying in Africa? Primitive cultures? No. Studying the basic philosophy of the Africans themselves. There's excellent work on it, and nobody is running any games on you, and nobody is hiding anything from you. And these books can be had in any good library, and they've been there all along, and they've been there unread because most people cannot believe their content. They cannot believe their content because for 500 years we have propagated the myth that the world waited in darkness for the Europeans to bring the light. When as a matter of fact, the European emerged into the light the second time. He destroyed more civilization than he ever built, and he destroyed nations that were already old when Europe was born. And once more, we must look at this early African contribution to man, so well documented in many books, mostly books by white writers that white scholars don't even read. The story of Imhotep, the real father of medicine, did not come from a book written by a black writer. I first encountered it into a history of modern medicine by an English writer, William Owsley. And he said this man who lived 5,000 years ago, over 1,000 years before the Greek, who is called the father of medicine, was the first figure of a physician to emerge clearly from the mist of history. He was more than a physician. He was a master builder. He was an astronomer. And he built the famous step pyramid and set in motion the period of massive building. I think what we need to do in dispelling the negative approach to Africa and going to a positive approach to Africa, we need to look at the impact of the African personality on the history of the world. And I think as good a place as any, although there were great African personalities before Imhotep, about 2980 BC, we need to look at Imhotep's first golden age and was now recovering from its first occupation by the people of Asia called the Shepherd Kings. This woman was a master builder, but more than anything else, she was a person that were sensitive about the relationship of Africans within Africa itself, especially East Africa. She said her grandmother came from the land of Punt, and her relatives still live in the land of Punt. That's present-day Somaliland. And the interesting thing to me about all of this, Punt and Cush, and the role of Moses in Africa, that as a Baptist Sunday school teacher, kind of the community intellect growing up, is that I began to search in the Bible for the role of my own people, and I could not find it. And I think this is what set my mind in motion and set me to thinking that someone has gone through some books and changed some things. I see Moses, an African, born in Africa, raised in Africa, going down to Ethiopia to marry Zipporah. Moses gets white, Zipporah gets white. I see in the Sunday school lesson people visiting the Cushites. The Cushites are the people in the Sudan. They are black now. Shall we assume that they were black then? I see people visiting Punt. That's present-day Somaliland. They are black now. Shall we assume that they were black then? And in the Sunday school lesson, they all got white. And I wondered, who changed, who dared to change this sacred book? Because at that time, growing up in a Baptist family, I was somewhat naive enough to believe that everything in the Bible was the truth. I have later examined it with a great deal of thoroughness, and now I can separate what can be documented by history and what is in the realm of mythology. And in the Bible, they identify Moses' one Ethiopian wife. My research found two more, and Zipporah was not Moses' first Ethiopian wife, but his second one, and briefly he had a third one after Zipporah. Now, if this man was so white and so Jewish, how did he develop this insatiable taste for chocolate? And why did he pass up all those Jewish girls to go all the way down there in Ethiopia, 1,000 miles away, and to marry one wife that history is willing to acknowledge he had, and two more that my research identifies him for having? What is this great fascination for Ethiopian women? Zipporah was the daughter of a high priest. Now, if you got a high priest, you got to have a religion worthy of a high priest. So obviously they had a well-organized religion and a high priest to complement that religion. I began to look into other stories about the story of the curse, and that according to this story, Noah's son looks upon Noah, who's had a little too much to drink and who's taken off his clothes and relaxing himself in his wine, with his wine. And his son laughs at him. But look what the Bible has Noah do to curse the son and his descendants to the end of time. Tell them their lips will be twisted, their hair will be curly. And people charge this to God. And if God is responsible for this, then God is not kind, and God is not merciful. Now, what we are dealing with is nothing to do with the Bible at all. We can throw the whole thing out, because all we're dealing with is folklore. And it took me years to understand what part of the Bible was folklore, and what part of the Bible was truth, and what part could be documented, and what part is in the realm of supposition. I'm saying the story of the curse that many of my people believed has no business in history, not even as a footnote. I'm saying that Mrs. Noah could have taken care of this whole thing by telling her son, now your father's been working hard, loading all these animals on this ark. Now he got them on, waiting for the flood. And some animals don't smell so well. So therefore he has resorted to wine and has overdone himself and overindulged. Let's put father to bed, and you, my son, remember, he is a good man and a good father in spite of overindulgence. And when addressing him, drunk or sober, keep a civil tongue in your head. And that would have been the end of that. It was Mrs. Noah's job to settle, and nothing else. In this foolish, stupid story that is an insult to the very Spirit of God, should not have been a part of the Bible at all. And so it's true of a whole lot of the Bible. That's a whole lot of mythological junk and has nothing to do with Christianity or spirituality. And a lot of it was drafted in the Bible after the Romans stopped killing Christians and became Christians and began to remold this religion to suit themselves. Now let's look very briefly at other periods and periods of change. I said that Africa had had one golden age when they were invaded from Asia. They would have a second golden age after the invasion, and then this would begin to decline around 751 BC when Egypt was invaded from within Africa, from the Sudan, by the Cushites, or Nubians, or Ethiopians, depending on what you want to call them at the time. But they were invaded from an area that is now part of Ethiopia physically. What is confusing here is that there was a period in African history when what is now the Sudan and what is now Ethiopia was one and the same. And you use the word Ethiopia, Cush, or Nubia, depending on what period you are referring to. In 751, Egypt was invaded from this area by a king named Castor. After him, his son Pianki. After him, Taharqa. The remarkable thing about this great military trio that it represents the last flowering of African military genius before the Assyrians, using iron, partly taken from the Africans, fashioned iron weapons instead of bronze, and pushed the Cushites to the south, and occupied Egypt and ruled it so ruthlessly until another Asian people, the Assyrians, the Persians, came in ostensibly to dislodge the Assyrians and became the rulers of Egypt. This combination of Asian rule was so bad until when a young Macedonian, Alexander, rose and began to push into Asia Minor, that by right should be called Africa Minor, because the people in this area were more African than Asia. And I was in this area a month ago and was somewhat shocked, although I should have known better, to see a number of jet black Arabs. And in the Persian Gulf states, the United Arab Emirates, I met 4 of the heads of state, and not one would be classified white in the United States right now. Not one. Because in this United States, with its stupid racial laws, and I'm not saying I believe them, in fact, I think it's an insult. If you have 1 drop of the blood of a black person, you're a whole black person. A crude kind of compliment to the strength of black blood and an insult to the intelligence of all people, black and white. Because no one's 1 drop makes one person a whole. And by using this stupidity, they have given us a whole lot of people we otherwise would not have. And because these sons and daughters that white men sired by black women were trapped among us, many of them rendered us some good service, more good than black, because out of them, thanks to their enlightened fathers, when they had enlightened fathers, and a few did, they were sent to school ahead of the blacks, and many of them were sent to school abroad by the white fathers who never married their mothers, but who kept up a pretty good relationship through the years, and many times took care of his children by his black mistress just as well as he did by the white woman who bore him white children. This is a door that has been closed, and we won't talk about it too extensively, because the people who make laws against interracial mixing has done the greatest amount of mixing before they made the law. We find that the greatest laws against interracial mixing is in the American South and in South Africa. And here are the places where the greatest amount of mixing has already occurred. And what we need to look at, and looking both ways, is Africa's contribution to the early development of Europe, Mediterranean Europe, the role of Africa in the rise of Christianity. And to do this, we must relieve ourselves of the nonsense about Christianity being a white man's religion, and read our history. Even the bad history books will tell you that the Romans killed people for almost 200 years for being Christians. Then they decided to become Christian. Christianity was born as a result of European oppression. And when the religion was fashioned out of old African religions, the Europeans did not think much of it at first and did not think it was a threat, and did not begin to persecute the Christians until later on. I think there's a need for an honest look at this religion and its African roots, because in the Book of the Dead and other documents taken out of Africa, the same religion existed in a different form, and not too different form, in Africa 2,000 years before the birth of Christ. John G. Jackson, one of my early teachers, who wrote the book Introduction to African Civilization, and another remarkable book on religion, Man, God, and Civilization, said that had Christ rose 200 years before he was supposed to rise, he could have read his own autobiography, because the story of the birth and the resurrection was part of the literature of the world long before the birth of Christ. And another work, Neglected Pagan Origins of the Christ Myth, he traces the Christ story through 26 civilizations, all of them at least 1,000 miles apart. And many of them had no evidence of contact with the others. And yet the story of the birth and the resurrection in these civilizations was almost identical. Sometime he rises by a difference of another day, and sometime he rises on another day, but all within a 10-day radius. Some of them might have been using different calendars. And all of these early symbols of the religion were symbols of black people. The symbol of the Madonna and Child in the churches of Europe was black, and was black for a long time. And in some of the churches of Europe, still black. A few years ago, literally driven to the wall by the McCarthy period, I accumulated a little money and left America for a year. So I had plenty of time to roam around in Rome, go in the Vatican, all the catacombs. I had nothing to do. I found these black Madonnas still there. And someone recently said that she's black because the candlelight over the years has blackened her. Now, if the candlelight blackened her face, her robe is still white. Why didn't the candlelight blacken her robe? It was closer to the candle than her face. The rationalization for the painting of this religion white don't hold up, making no kind of sense. And I think we need to go back and read one of the many good books on the Nicene Conference in about 331 AD. It was here at the Nicene Conference in a little city between Turkey, what is now Turkey, and Greece, But in a little city there in Mediterranean Europe, they met and began to transform Christianity from an African and Asian religion to a predominantly European religion. They were about to take over the church then and make it a political instrument and a justification for their domination over most of the world of that day. In the 15th and the 16th century, they would use the same religion to justify the slave trade and the development and the expansion of Europe over most of the world. It would be their handmaiden. But this religion to Europeans has never been what it was to us in the beginning. It has never been what it was to the great African teachers of the faith, the African fathers of the church that we have tended to forget, the four African popes, and while St. Augustine was best known, we have forgotten Cyprian and Tertullian and other Africans who made a major contribution to the formation of the church. They've forgotten the African who literally introduced Latin as the language of the church. And then after Rome got well underway, Africans would play a major role in the armies of Rome. And prior to that, an African had been emperor of Rome, one of the most noted of the emperors, Septimius Severus, who was also governor of a country that would later emerge as England. And the interesting thing about Septimius Severus, while politically he was as Roman as any Roman, culturally he was as African as any African. He couldn't stand Roman food, and ships would bring back and forth the foods and the spices of Africa with cooks to prepare it. And he thought the food of England was so abominable, he wouldn't feed it to pigs. And there has been some slight improvement, but the British have built an empire and still don't know how to cook a tasty meal. In all my roaming in England, I have not found one meal comparable to the meal that those old sisters turned out in my growing up in the South when they could find the ingredients. Now, the interesting thing about Septimius Severus, and this is what makes me say that he was politically as Roman as any Roman, but culturally as African as any African, that when he advised the Romans to give up England, it was this African looking back smugly on the British people and said that we will not force them to fight for their independence. We will give it to them. They are so unworthy, so backward. They are not even worth 10 Roman soldiers. Don't even bring them to Rome as domestic servants. I doubt if they have the intelligence to put down a plate before a diner. This was an African saying this about England. In 198 AD, he would later, upon his departure, look back at the shores of England and said, I wonder what will they do now that we are no longer here to manage their affairs. Maybe they will go back in trees. When the British governor gave up the last British power in Nigeria and was ready to sail home to England, he said the identical same thing about the Nigerians. Beware of judging people when they're down, because there's no telling what they do when they get up, and they might be your judges 2,000 years down the road. Now, with the mismanagement of Christianity, and I don't know why this period is so neglected, the European mismanagement of Christianity to the point where the people in North Africa and in Western Asia turned away from it and began to search for a new religion. The fight between the people of Southern Europe, Byzantium, and the Roman crowd, the fight between the Romans and a Germanic people called the Vandals, the military triumph of the Vandals about 450 AD, destroying the effective military power of Rome because the Roman army was of no consequence after this, and they never fully recovered from it. And now, with the weakened military might of Rome, the people in southern Europe, in the Mediterranean area, more closest to North Africa, where the North African church was in ascendancy, decided to take over the church. And this fight between the two of them literally destroyed the church and made the religion distasteful to its creators. And this opened the door for the rise of Islam. And Islam rose while Rome was falling and the Europeans were retreating back into Europe, where they would go into what they themselves call their dark ages. As a consequence of the rise of Islam, the prophet, using two Ethiopians, and they have been unfortunately forgotten in the general literature of the religion, although they are well remembered in the Encyclopedia of Islam and in the literature of early Islam written by the Arabs themselves. The Arab historians have a way of hailing Africans principally because they are great Muslims, without ever telling you that aside from being a Muslim, he was an African. These two Ethiopians, Zayd bin Harit and Bilal being the first man to proclaim the prayers, not only were advisors to the prophet, but it was they who told him to send some of his leading followers to Ethiopia for safety when the religion was about to be driven out of Arabia. Go, he said, to that righteous nation where no one is wrong. Now, what is there in the character of the Ethiopians that made them be referred to as a righteous nation where no one is wrong? And what is there also in the character of the Ethiopians that made the Greeks refer to them as the blameless people and the favorites of the gods? Now, what happened to this favorite? What happened to this enlightened and complimentary picture of Africa coming from Europeans? At what point did they drop all of these compliments about Africa and invent the primitive and the savage when they wanted to enslave the African and needed a rationale? They knew that the savage was an invention of their own mind and that the primitive was an invention of their own mind. They knew that they were not meeting backward primitive people. They had been introduced to African people, and Africa in its grandeur was part of the literature of the Europeans. And when they came down the west coast of Africa looking for the kingdom of Prester John, they were also looking for the legendary gold cities of Africa. and looking to confirm the fact or the myth that there were cities in Africa roofed in gold and women so splendid, if you would stare at them for a moment, you would lose your eyesight. They were getting a whole lot of things mixed up. They were getting the cities where the African used thatch and gold on the roof mixed up with the women. The women they were talking about were the legendary and almost painstakingly beautiful Wolof and Bambara women in Senegal and in that area. And I have visited that area many times. While my eyesight remained intact, my equilibrium had something else as a reaction. They are still some of the most stately, beautiful women in the world. And a Wolof woman selling fish in the market is generally better dressed than a Western woman going to a ball. And this is not European dress. That beautiful dress, those flowing gowns that they wear, even in the marketplace, was there when the Europeans arrived. And when other people came down into this part of Africa, they found these women highly dress conscious. And the older the woman, the better she dresses. And still that. But because the European was picking up history through rumors, they got so many things mixed up. They got even the sides of Africa mixed up. Prester John was in Ethiopia. The Gold City was in Inner Africa. Other legends came from the coast, and other legends came from the hinterlands. And we have a number of eyewitness accounts to all of this. What I'm trying to pinpoint is that when Europe went into the age that they call their Dark Age, a third golden age developed in Africa. The genius of state building shifted toward inner West Africa. The great caravan trades were accentuated. Africans trading with then Mediterranean Europe and North Africa. Great trains of tradesmen coming across the Sahara, bringing goods and services, taking goods and services out. 3 great empires developed in the area: Ghana, Mali, Sangay. Magnificent leaders, the like of which the world had never known before. The area had recovered from the second disastrous invasion of Islam by Islamized blacks called Almoravids, who had then in part gone to Spain to help their co-religionists tame the so-called Cid. Now the area with a breathing spell became more Muslim than ever, now that no one was trying to force them to become Muslim voluntarily. Large states became part of this religion, one being the state of Mali during the period of Mansa Musa, the great publicist of ancient medieval Africa.